Should I have empathy for people who cause tremendous harm? This is a question that you've been asking me a lot in different ways. For example, the latest one came from Charlotte, who's saying something like, what if I were to face someone like Netanyahu? Would NVC mean that I would have to empathize with his needs, or what does that look like? I understand this question in the sense that NVC promotes empathy as something that prevents violence and creates connection, right? And it does a really good job at that if you've tried any of it. But if we have empathy as the only approach to people with ideas that cause violence, then aren't we getting more violence as a result? Basically, that's the question. And so in this video, I'll discuss Marshall Rosenberg, the founder of NVC, as you may know, his view on it, as well as some other philosophers and thinkers. And I'll also have a practical tool when it comes to the feeling behind this message. So I'm Marianne. I have over a decade experience in teaching people the skill of empathy in my NVC program. I'm also certified as a trauma-informed coach, and I have a master degree in philosophy, which I don't think I ever mentioned, but I think for this video, we're diving into kind of like a bit more political / philosophical debate. So we're going to make use of that as well. Also, I'm talking about this from the perspective of a white Western woman, right? So I do quote a diversity of sources, but please put your view on this and your experience with this in the comments. So this can be a debate and not a one-way thing where I hold the truth or something, which I don't. Okay, so first let's get the concept straight. Because empathy is, especially in psychology, there's different levels of empathy. And for the sake of this video, we're going to keep it simple and we're going to use Marshall Rosenberg's way of defining it, which is that empathy is a skill that we can train as human beings. And compassion is the feeling that it might lead to as a result. So let's say, for example, that I, as a human being, am watching a documentary about a serial killer. The serial killer, his name is Mickey, and Mickey has and killed over 35 women in the past years, and he's in prison now, but there's a documentary about him. And I'm watching this documentary and I'm learning that Mickey's mom used to lock him up in a cage at the age of 3 whenever he would cry. And also she didn't give him a lot of food. He had to kind of fend for himself. And at some point, the one friend that he had in school, his mom started to spread a rumor about him that he was gay. And as a result, he also lost that one friend that he had. Now, in my willingness to watch the documentary is in a way already an empathic skill, right? I'm willing to be present with his story and to not judge right away, not even want to hear it. So that's already displaying empathy. And then my getting understanding of what he came from is also part of empathy, right? Understanding of how someone got to their behavior. Does that mean that I now approve of Mickey's behavior? No, it does not, right? Now, as a result of these empathic skills that I'm applying, I might get a feeling of compassion, especially when I hear that he lost the one source of love that he had, this one friend in school. I might have a sensation of softness or sadness or being moved by someone's story, right? This is how compassion might show up. Does this mean I approve of his behavior? No, it does not. Okay, so now let's say that Mickey got out of prison and now he wants to start a political career. He actually wants to run for president. And now I'm funding his campaign, right? So basically I'm saying that I think he's a good model as a citizen. So now I'm kind of agreeing with his ideas and his ways of relating to women, which are also showing in his, in his policies, right? So agreeing with someone's ideas, that's what Marshall Rosenberg calls sympathy. And then we can add to that, if you actively support that, we could call that solidarity. So one thing that I really emphasize when I work with people, because I see this misunderstanding about this, is that when you're listening to someone that you don't agree with, that you can be empathetic and that it doesn't mean that you agree with their opinions. And that's really one thing that once that lands, it creates so much more connection with people that you might never agree with, right? Which is one thing that we really need in this polarizing world. So all in all, empathy prevents us from becoming violent in whatever degree, right? In the face of opinions and behavior that we might not approve of. And so if you want to do one thing for your relationship and for the world, I would say it's to learn the skill of empathy. I think if all genders, ideally, would learn about this, we would live in a different world. And I'd say that NVC has the most profound and practical approach to it. So I highly recommend, if you haven't looked into it. I have, for example, a free webinar that you can follow. I'll put it up here so that you can just start really practicing that skill. Now, as some of you have pointed out, and as I've seen myself as well, there is a limit to this empathy that we can give. The philosopher that has best, I think, most profoundly described this is named Karl Popper. He's an Austrian philosopher who passed away in the 90s. And he really looked at it from a societal level, whereas Marshall Rosenberg looks a bit more at the interpersonal level. But I think it's very helpful to add this, because he says that if we empathize, or even just are tolerant, so that's not even yet empathy, but just are tolerant to those who promote intolerance, then the intolerant people will eventually destroy the very tolerance that allowed them to exist. So basically, if we tolerate everything, including those who reject tolerance, they can rise to power, silence others, and end all tolerance. So Karl Popper points out how fragile of a system tolerance or empathy, right, which is an even, again, more deeper version of that, how fragile that is and how it needs to be protected. Otherwise, it will be abolished altogether. And so Marshall Rosenberg did see that as well and came up with the idea of protective use of force, which is, again, more interpersonal. But what it means is that, let's say now Mickey did become president, even though he was a convicted felon, right? But he was kind of unsuccessful and he stopped being in politics, but he still needs the power, right? Because he's still very traumatized. And at some point he goes back to harming women and he gets into my house. And before I can do anything, I have, this is a true story. I was looking around in my house. I was like, if Mickey would get into my house, because this was a serious situation that I was imagining, what would I use to defend I don't have a like baseball bat or something. I have a clock that my landlord left for me, which is some sort of an heirloom that is extremely heavy. So let's imagine I would use that clock, hitting on the head with it. He doesn't die, but he's severely injured, right? Now, does that mean that I no longer wish empathy for Mickey? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means I use protective use of force. Now, if additionally, when he's lying there, I cut off his penis, now that is what Marshall Rosenberg would call punitive force, because that's not needed to protect myself. I'm doing that only to cause hurt in someone else, right? That's the end goal of what I'm doing. And so that's where the distinction lies. Similarly, a bit smaller situation, let's say that your child is ripping up your favorite book. You can physically stop your child from doing that. That's using protective use of force. There might not be time for a dialogue, right? Which is, ideally we would always start with a dialogue, but there's not always time for that. And sometimes the dialogue is not enough, right? And then we might need to use the protective use of force. Again, I'm not saying to the child, now you have to go sit in a corner and stand there for an hour. That is not needed to protect my book. That is just to try and teach someone a lesson by overpowering them, right? That's usually doesn't really work. Now, in the examples that Marshall Rosenberg uses, it's often about kind of physical harm, whether to an object or to a person. But he also mentions the term injustice. So protective use of force can be used for injustice in general. And then the question rises, what is injustice, right? That is like a political, philosophical question that he doesn't really answer. He comes up with two questions that should be an answer, that are two questions that you can ask yourself before you act. The first one is, am I acting from fear, anger, or moral superiority? And the second one is my aim really to protect life or to make someone do what I think is right? Now, those questions are not completely useless, but they're not sufficient. So say, for example, that I've been bullied or molested by someone for weeks, and now I want to stand up for myself or protect myself, and I do also feel anger. Does that now mean that whatever I do is no longer counts as protective use of force because I also have a lot of anger? It's a bit tricky, right? So I think it's not quite sufficient to answer that question. The second challenge with MVC stems from the fact that using the skills of empathy requires energy. It requires training and it requires energy. And it's what we could call emotional labor, right? That's the term we use nowadays that Marshall Rosenberg didn't use yet. And historically, doing this type of emotional labor has been asked disproportionately from underprivileged people. So women, people of color, disabled people, queer people, etc. Sociologists and feminist theorists like Sarah Ahmed and Bell Hooks point out that marginalized groups are often required to empathize upwards. So to understand oppressors, employers, men, white people, etc., while the reverse is less often expected. So an example of this, let's get back to the story of Mickey. Let's say Mickey is 15 years old and he hasn't yet any women or killed any women, but he first molests a little girl, right? And the police finds out, but Mickey is kind of a smart boy as well. And they don't give him any consequences because they say, well, he has such a bright future ahead of him, right? And this is something that we hear sometimes, right? And so in this situation, we are asked to empathize with and care for the life of the perpetrator rather than the victim whose potential to a bright future goes unexplored, right? So that doesn't mean that empathy itself is not an effective tool, right? It just means that it operates within the constraints of our societal systems. And those systems, in my opinion, need to change. And this is why I explicitly work with the theme of people pleasing, which is a survival strategy that a lot of underprivileged people have, that I also know personally, where empathy is an automatic habit. Right? It's no longer a skill that we deliberately apply. It's a survival skill that we automatically do to survive. That's what we learn to do to survive, right? And so there it becomes very important to distinguish between realizing that this other person, this perpetrator, or even this employer that has racist comments or whatever, they deserve empathy, but not from me, right? They deserve empathy in general, but I don't have to do the emotional labor. I can choose to do it if I want to, but I don't have to. It's not a have to. And this goes in general, right? Empathy, when empathy becomes a have to, when it becomes a duty, it's not even real. I wouldn't even call it real empathy anymore, right? It needs to be voluntarily. And so this is where we want to distinguish that all people deserve empathy, but I might not be the one that is going to do the emotional labor in this case, right? My mother-in-law who has comments on my body deserves empathy, but I don't have to be the one to do that emotional labor. And this is what I guide people to do, right? To look for and to recognize what I call symmetrical empathy, where the empathy is reciprocated in all the connections that you invest in, basically. And if you want to learn how to start doing that, I have a playlist about people pleasing that I'll put up here that you can start watching and you can start working on that. I'm also available for one-on-one sessions. You can send me an email. I'll put my email address below. And so you can start moving through that as well. So back to the experience of Charlotte, my follower, who was, I guess, not only asking about the theoretical framework, right, but about NVC and whether it has any boundaries to empathy, which we've seen it does, but you need to kind of rely on the individual additional skills of an NVC trainer to guide you through that. But I think she was also expressing kind of a sense of hopelessness about the state of the world and about how our leaders misuse their power basically and use violence as a way to get their needs met. And so here what I would say is that when we ask like, oh, why should I have empathy? It's kind of like a sign that we don't have the capacity for empathy right now, right? That's the first thing that's important to recognize, that it shouldn't be a duty. If it's a duty, it's not real empathy anyway. So it just means you need recharging. And what's often needed the most is grief. So basically I see grieving about either the state of the world, but also maybe about a personal one-to-one situation as a prerequisite for empathy. Right? So grief is a prerequisite for empathy. If we don't allow our pain, our rage, our sadness to come out and to process, we are likely to become numb and we're likely to not have the capacity for empathy anymore. This is how people like Mickey become the way they become, right? They no longer can afford to have empathy. And so grieving, when it's not really related to the loss of a person, we often don't have the tools and the rituals to deal with that. It's often kind of overlooked as an activity that we might need to carve out time for, and a time in which we're not getting more input that is harmful. So no more news, or whatever person might be, bullying you, or be difficult for you. Like, we need a break from that if possible at all. And in which we also might want to come together with others who may have experienced something similar, and to exchange empathy, to exchange empathy rather than sympathy, right? It might be very tempting to go for sympathy, but research shows that empathy is more healing in the long run. We might need a moment of sympathy. We might want a moment of sympathy. It can create a bonding moment for a while, but if we want our feelings to start moving, we need empathy. That's basically the thing. And I also personally like creating art and doing activism. Activism has also proven, especially for people who are idealists and who are frustrated about how the world is, that activism helps to restore our sense of satisfaction, life satisfaction, really. And yeah, so those things I really recommend. And I know that this is just the tip of the iceberg with all of what I said, right? There's so much more to say about this, but I'd love to know in the comments what you thought of this. So both of this the concept of empathy and compassion and sympathy, the story of Mickey, what you thought of that, and also the view of Karl Popper on this whole the fragility of empathy, right, and how it needs to be protected on a societal level, and the views of Ahmed and Hooks about this upwards empathy, right? How marginalized people need to empathize upwards, and the topic of grief. I'm curious about all your ideas about that. So let this be the start of a conversation. And please, if you want to support this type of videos, it really, really helps me if you can like and subscribe. My channel is growing. We almost have 25,000 followers now, but this is not the type of super clickbaity content, but it is the type of content that I think is important to go out if we want to prevent more violence in the world, which is what I strive for. And also, please come to my live webinar. I'd love to meet you live and see who is watching this video, because now I'm talking to a camera right now, and I'd love to know you personally. So yeah, see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.